gentleman from Oklahoma.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since the passage of the original authorization for the use of military force directed against Al-Quaeda in 2001, the makeup of the Congress has changed, and frankly, the conflict in which we find ourselves in the war on terror has also changed. We find ourselves...
Span. The House will come to order. The gentleman that deserves to be heard on this amendment. Please remove conversations from the floor in the committee. Committee will come to order. The gentleman from Oklahoma may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, since 2001, we passed the original authorization for the use of military force against Al-Quaeda and against associated enemies. The nature of the war on terror in which we find ourselves has changed dramatically, and we now find ourselves fighting enemies that simply did not exist at the time in areas that nobody in Congress anticipated we would be at war. This has caused a number of us to have very serious concerns as to whether or not the original authorization for the use of military force is still relevant. And frankly, many of us have concerns that the war-making power of Congress is slipping away from us. Indeed, we find ourselves engaged since that original AUMF in 14 different countries on more than almost 40 different occasions without Congress authorizing the use of force. So in our view, a new AUMF is necessary. However, I also recognize that needs to come through a process. And so my effort here is to try and set up a process where the administration can participate, we can have an orderly discussion, and the appropriate committees can mark up a new AUMF if Congress indeed thinks it does. And again, I think many of us do. A new AUMF would provide clear authority for ongoing operations against ISIS and other terrorist groups, and it would fulfill the constitutional responsibility of Congress to authorize the use of force. My amendment directs the President to put forward a strategy, an analysis, and a framework that we can actually debate and take action on. The underlying bill being considered today provides authorization for training and equipping our military, just as important as the time of debate and deliberate how that military should be used to defeat our enemies. Recently, in an appearance before the House Appropriations, the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, Secretary Mattis made an appearance. I actually asked him, would it be helpful to have an AUMF? And at that time he said it absolutely would be helpful. Our men and women that we've deployed in places, again, that nobody in 2001 thought they would be deployed to, need to know that the Congress of the United States is fully supportive of their deployment. So this amendment would direct that the President, within 30 days after the passage of the legislation, present to Congress a report that, again, justifies the action, tells us the strategy, lays out the objectives. And within 30 days after that report was received, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense could be called before the relevant committees to actually explain and defend that. Now, again, in my view, I still think we need a new authorization for the use of military force, but I want to start a process whereby that can begin, and I think this would help us achieve that. If others have a different opinion, that's fine too, but I think they would still find the report useful and the testimony invaluable. Sooner or later, Congress needs to take responsibility. I think with the best will in the world, we've slipped into almost endless warfare in a lot of places that none of us anticipated we would be. And again, these are not actions that I necessarily question, but I think they have not been authorized, not been debated, not been examined. And frankly, the American people have been denied that debate. We've also, frankly, they've been denied the opportunity to hold their members responsible. Remember, that original authorization for the use of military force was 2001. Almost 80% of the members of this body have been elected since that original authorization. I think they ought to be listen to the debate, and frankly, their constituents ought to be able to hold them accountable. So I would urge the adoption of the amendment. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment, although I will not oppose the amendment.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Cole amendment. I'm a great admirer of the gentleman from Oklahoma. We have worked together on several bipartisan letters to Speaker Ryan asking that the Speaker bring to the House floor an AUMF to address the fight against the Islamic State in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. I value the gentleman's leadership and desire to find common ground with members on both sides of the aisle. But it is frustrating, Mr. Chairman, to know that this amendment was made in order while every other amendment to require the House to take concrete action on these wars were denied their right to debate. Now, maybe my good friend from Oklahoma is right, and Congress has to take baby steps. It needs yet another report on Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Its committees on foreign affairs and armed services need to be ordered to hold hearings with the Secretaries of Defense and State to review these matters. But what then? According to this amendment, nothing. Now, I've had my fill of Congress doing nothing. I admire the gentleman from Oklahoma. I support his amendment, but I'm sick and tired of reports. After 16 years in Afghanistan, we need a debate on the future of U.S. military engagement there, and we need it now. The gentleman said sooner or later. Well, after 16 years, we have already arrived at sooner and later. After 6 years of military operations in Iraq and Syria, we need to vote on an AUMF to address the fight against the Islamic State, and we need it now. How much longer will Congress keep our brave servicemen and women to war while it sits on its hands back here in Washington, safe and sound? So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, but I demand that the House Republican leadership find the courage to act on these matters now. Our troops and their families deserve more than silence from a Congress that has no qualms about sending them to war, but fails to have the political courage to take a vote. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, the gentleman from Texas.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the gentleman from Oklahoma and his consistent, strong leadership on this issue. I, like him, believe that it is time to have a new AUMF, given the change of circumstances and the evolution of the threats which we face. This is the third administration that has had to take the 2001 AUMF and stretch its meaning to encompass all sorts of groups in all sorts of countries in all sorts of circumstances. And I think from a legal standpoint, we need to update the AUMF so that we are consistent with the intent of the Constitution. The even more important point is the point the gentleman from Oklahoma made, and that is the men and women who are out there risking their lives deserve to know they have the full backing of the country, and that comes from an AUMF that Congress has passed. I do want to take exception with one point that is sometimes made. This House has voted twice to update the 2001 AUMF. It voted in 2011 and in 2012 to update that AUMF to include associations. It happened to be part of the NDAA, even though the Armed Services Committee is not the committee of jurisdiction. The Foreign Affairs Committee worked with us, and we passed it twice in the House. It did not survive contact with the Senate, and although there was some detention language that came from it, but there have been efforts in this House to update this language. But I think the gentleman's approach is exactly right. Ask for the strategy, the budget that goes with it, the legal framework we are to follow, including the AUMF. So I do think it's a methodical, deliberate process that will take us closer to doing what we ought to do, and that it does include updating this authorization for the use of military force against terrorist groups as that terrorist threat evolves. I commend the gentleman for his amendment and support it.
Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Armed Services Committee,